Hello, and welcome to Samiljeol. I'm your host, Samiljeol, and if you're returning and are a subscriber, 안녕하십니까?
Oh,
Make yourself at home. Take a seat. This is going to be pretty interesting today. Because of our first video being so surprisingly successful, even though I didn't fully complete the story on Shin, I decided to cover another subject that is coming up in the next couple of days. Actually, it's coming out today. And what is that event, you may ask? Samilun동. Now, for reference, Samilun동. So Sam and Il are Sino-Korean numbers meaning 3 and 1, respectively. All right? And undong means exercise. So 삼일운동 means 3-1 exercise. Like the verb 운동하다 means to exercise. 삼일운동, March 1st movement. Without further ado, 준비, 시작!
수양대군 납시오!
We'll start off with the Kangwado Incident of 1875 and the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876. The Imo Incident of 1882, followed by the Japanese-Korea Treaty of 1882. We also have the Gapshin coup that happened in 1884, and then we have the Donghak Revolution and the First Sino-Japanese War. We also have the assassination of Queen Myeongsung in 1895. We have democracy protests and the establishment of the Korean Empire from the Joseon Kingdom in 1897. We also then have the Russo-Japanese War, the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1905, and the Hague Secret Emissary Affair. And we also have the assassination of Ito Hirobumi in 1909 by An Jung-gun. This would also be a prelude to annexation of Korea in 1910. The Japanese land ownership in Korea's farmable lands was about 7 to 8% at the time. In 1916, this would grow up to about 36 to 37%, and in 1920, this would jump up to 40%, ultimately ending in 1932 at 53%. The tax on the tenants that were Koreans that had originally lived in these lands that they once owned had to pay over half of the rice they grew in taxes. And if they couldn't afford that, they had to force their wives and daughters to work in factories, or even worse, prostitution, in order to make money to live off the land owned by the Japanese government at the time. To top it all off, we have the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, in which the Korean Provisional Government, headquartered in Shanghai, China, tried to send 3 representatives to talk about Koreans' unfair treatment under Japanese colonization. However, the world didn't really pay it any mind. On March 1st, 1919, around 2 p.m., 33 independence activists got together at the Taegwan Shikdang in Seoul. Now, the question is, if the Samiljeol was a huge protest around Korea, why did 33 leaders gather at a restaurant all of a sudden? They were currently drafting a copy of the Korean Declaration of Independence at the time. All 33 members had yet to have signed the document in order to send a copy to the Governor General, who was Japanese, running Korea at the time. And over the next 12 months, over 2 million Koreans would protest against Japanese colonization. Now, the Samiljeol started in Pagoda Park, mainly. That's where student Chung Jae-young read the Declaration of Independence in front of a crowd. And as the crowd started getting bigger, the Japanese police started to worry. The crowds were growing in huge numbers, and not just in Seoul. They were doing this all over Korea at the same time, 2 p.m. on March 1st, 1919. Over the course of the next 40 days, There were reports from Korean sources and Japanese sources stating that about 7,509-ish people were killed during these protests. About 15,846 people were injured, and about 46,303 people were arrested. Some of them were even publicly executed for the demonstrations. The protest at Pagoda Park started out as a peaceful assembly. They were just marching. Then the crowds grew. The Japanese officers panicked. They brought in the military to quell what they thought was pretty much a rebellion, and depending on how you look at it, yeah. But it was supposed to be a protest. They wanted Japan to kind of get pressured on to stop what they were doing and realize that, hey, maybe we should lessen what we got going on here. Well, that kind of didn't happen. But let's throw some Japanese numbers into perspective here. The Japanese reported about 553 people killed, about 12,000 arrested, and about 8 military and police personnel were killed, with another 158 being injured at the time. Now, I don't know which side you're on. I don't really care. You make your own determination off of that. Now, the Koreans would call this time the 대한독립만세, or the bloody period of the Korean independence movement. But I do want to consider talking about one specific female that is well known around Korea as the Joan of Arc, and also Yugwansu Nuna, or Yugwansu Onni. She was 17 at the time during these protests that began on March 1st. She would flee from Seoul because by March 10th, the Japanese police and military had shut down all the schools in Seoul. Yu Guan-sun went back to her native province, Chungcheongnam-do, which is east of Seoul. On April 1st, she and a couple of friends had managed to recruit about 3,000 people from neighboring towns and villages, shouting 대한독립만세, which means pretty much long live the Korean resistance or the Korean independence. 3,000 people shouting this at Japanese officials in a much smaller city or town than Seoul was at the time. Yu Guan-sun ended up getting arrested, and if I do remember correctly, both of her parents around this time were also killed on the same day. So the Japanese officials had put her into custody and had tried to leverage her release by pretty much throwing out names of all the facilitators for these protests that she knew firsthand. But guess what? Yu Guan-sun didn't do any of that. After her arrest on April 1st, she was given a very unfair trial headed by Japanese officials, overseen by a Japanese judge, handled by the Governor General of Korea, and she pretty much appealed to have a fair trial. But her attempts were unanswered. So she received a 5-year prison sentence and was sent to Sodaemun in Seoul. Sodaemun is now the modern name for the jail that she was sent to back then. Between April 1st, the trial proceedings, and her untimely death, she was only 18 in 1920, where she had kept silent mostly about the people that she collaborated with, had relations with in creating these protests. Even in being severely beaten and tortured until the day she died over a year later, she didn't bother to throw anybody out there. Even, it's so wild to me. It is so wild to me that, she was beaten to death, basically, in prison. Her 2 principals from her school threatened to tell pretty much everyone about her unfair torture by the Japanese. And what did the Japanese do upon her death? Well, They put her in a Saucony vacuum crate and just left her there. Yu Guan-sun was buried in Itaewon Cemetery. Now, between then and 1920 and by the end of 1945, the Japanese had removed the Itaewon Cemetery. They destroyed the cemetery to build a military building over top of it. How quaint, right? Yu Guan-sun's body was never found after this. She has a current resting place in Chungcheongnam-do, where she's originally from. However, to this day, there's still no body in the grave. It's an empty grave. So what all came of this? The 대한독립, or the Korean independence movement, did it really affect immediate change? No. Did it help kind of lessen the hold of Japanese imperialism on Korea? Kind of yes and no. The world had opened its eyes to what was currently going on in Korea during this time. However, in retrospect, you still had Japanese names being assimilated to the Korean populace. You had the outlawing and forbidden use of Korean language, Korean names, Korean culture. And also, if you haven't seen the sweatshirt that I'm wearing, we have 5 freedom fighters on this shirt, made by Kore Limited out of California. Now, without further ado, let me do something fun at the end to kind of lighten the mood a little bit.